Some of the most exhausting moments in life do not appear dramatic from the outside. They unfold quietly in the background of your day, when you are lying in bed replaying a conversation that you wish had gone differently, or when you carry a silent fear that if you stop trying so hard, everything around you will begin to fall apart. And over time you begin to believe that the tighter you hold on to people, to plans, and to expectations, the safer you will feel. But Stoic philosophy teaches something very different, because the Stoics understood that this constant tension, this need to control, does not protect you. It traps you, it drains your energy, and it keeps your mind in a state of unrest. Because the more you try to force life into a fixed shape, the more you suffer when it refuses to stay that way. And the truth is that letting go is not about giving up. It is about learning to meet life as it is, with clarity and discipline instead of fear. And when you begin to release the illusion that everything must be controlled, you discover that the peace you have been searching for was never outside of you. It was always hidden beneath the tension you were carrying. There is a pattern that the mind repeats constantly, one that feels productive but often leads nowhere. And that is the belief that if you can just stay one step ahead, if you can anticipate every possible problem, if you can manage every detail, then somehow life will not surprise you in painful ways, and you recognize this feeling in the way your body reacts when something unexpected happens, when your chest tightens, when your thoughts accelerate, when you feel the need to explain, to fix, to control, because letting go feels like losing balance. But the Stoics saw through this illusion because they understood that the desire to control everything is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of fear. And Epictetus taught that some things are within your control and some things are not. And the moment you try to control what is not yours to control, you create unnecessary suffering because you are fighting against reality itself. Think about how often your mind convinces you that if you just try a little harder, you will finally feel safe, that if you can control how people see you, you will avoid rejection, that if you can organize everything perfectly, you will avoid falling behind, that if you can manage other people's emotions, you will never lose connection. And in the moment, these thoughts feel reasonable because action feels better than uncertainty. But the reality is that the more you tighten your grip, the more fragile everything becomes, because life is not designed to be held that way. And Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and much of that suffering comes from trying to secure outcomes that were never guaranteed. The Stoics spoke often about accepting the nature of life as it is, not as you wish it to be. And Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that you cannot control what happens around you, but you can always control how you respond to it. And when you begin to live by this principle, something shifts within you, because you stop trying to manage everything, and instead you start managing yourself, your thoughts, your reactions, your discipline, and this shift creates a kind of stability that does not depend on circumstances, because it is rooted in something internal rather than external. Consider how much energy you have spent trying to manage what cannot be managed, replaying conversations to control how you are perceived, over-preparing to control outcomes, analyzing every silence to prevent rejection, and all the while, life continues to unfold in ways that are not influenced by your overthinking. And the irony is that when you finally loosen your grip, when you allow yourself to step back and trust your ability to respond rather than control, you begin to feel lighter because you are no longer resisting what is already happening. Ask yourself, without pressure, what would change if you stopped trying to control everything? Not because you do not care, but because you understand that caring does not require control. What would shift if you allowed people to respond as they choose, if you allowed plans to change, if you allowed yourself to be imperfect? Because Stoicism does not promise a life without discomfort, but it does offer a way to move through discomfort without being overwhelmed by it, by showing you that much of your suffering comes not from reality, but from your resistance to it. There is also a misunderstanding about strength that many people carry. The belief that strength means holding on, pushing through, never bending, never stepping back. But the Stoics understood that true strength is not found in constant resistance, but in knowing when to release what is no longer within your control, because holding on to something that is already changing does not make you strong. It makes you exhausted. And Seneca wrote that difficulties strengthen the mind, but only when they are faced with reason, not when they are resisted blindly. When you look at your own life, you can probably identify moments where you held on too tightly to a relationship that was no longer aligned, to a path that drained your energy, to an idea of yourself that no longer reflected who you were becoming. And in those moments, what felt like strength was often just fear. Fear of change, fear of uncertainty, fear of losing control. But Stoicism teaches that change is not something to resist. It is something to understand, because everything in life is in constant motion, and the more you try to freeze it, the more tension you create. Letting go, then, becomes an act of clarity, not weakness. It becomes the recognition that you cannot force outcomes, that you cannot guarantee stability, that you cannot avoid uncertainty, but you can always choose how you respond. And when you begin to act from that understanding, your actions become more focused, more intentional, because they are no longer driven by fear, they are guided by reason. There is also a paradox that reveals itself over time, that the more you try to hold on to something, the more you disrupt its natural flow, and the more you allow it to exist without force, the more stable it becomes, because when you stop attaching your identity to outcomes, you create space for things to develop naturally. And this applies to relationships, to work, to personal growth. Because when you act from a place of desperation, you create pressure, but when you act from a place of clarity, you create alignment. Overthinking plays a major role in this cycle because it creates the illusion that you are solving problems when you are often just amplifying them, and you may recognize the feeling of being mentally exhausted from thinking without finding clarity, because the more you analyze, the more complicated everything seems. And this is because clarity does not come from constant thinking. It comes from stepping back, from observing, from allowing your mind to settle rather than forcing it to produce answers. Marcus Aurelius practiced this regularly, reminding himself to return to the present moment, to focus only on what was in front of him. And when you begin to apply this, you notice that many of the problems your mind creates do not exist in the present. They exist in imagined futures or replayed pasts, and by returning to what is real, you reduce the noise that keeps you stuck. There is also a kind of exhaustion that comes from caring too much in the wrong way, from feeling responsible for everything, from believing that if you do not hold everything together, everything will fall apart. And while it may feel like compassion, it is often rooted in control, in the belief that you must manage outcomes to maintain stability. But Stoicism teaches that you can care without carrying everything, that you can support others without losing yourself, that you can act with integrity without taking responsibility for what is not yours. You begin to see that true strength is not in controlling everything, but in knowing what is yours to carry and what is not. And this creates a kind of balance, where you are engaged with life without being overwhelmed by it, where you are present without being consumed, and where your sense of self remains stable regardless of external conditions. Validation is another layer of this pattern, because it is easy to become dependent on how others respond to you, to measure your worth based on approval, to adjust your behavior to fit expectations. But the Stoics warned against this, because they understood that external validation is unstable. It changes constantly, and if your sense of self depends on it, your stability will always be uncertain. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the approval of others is not something to rely on, because people's opinions are shaped by their own perspectives, their own limitations, and their own concerns. And when you begin to internalize this, you stop seeking validation as a necessity, and instead you focus on acting in alignment with your values. And this creates a form of confidence that is stable because it is not dependent on external feedback. As all of this begins to come together, you start to notice a deeper shift, one where your life feels less chaotic, not because everything is under control, but because you are no longer reacting to everything. You are choosing your responses. You are no longer trying to force outcomes. You are acting with clarity, and this creates a sense of peace that is not fragile but steady. And in that steadiness, you begin to understand something that changes everything, that your life is not defined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to it. And the more you align your actions with this understanding, the more control you gain over the only thing that truly matters, which is yourself. As this awareness continues to unfold, you begin to notice that there is another layer beneath everything you have already understood, something even more subtle but far more influential in shaping your experience of life. And that is the realization that your mind is constantly trying to create certainty in a world that is inherently uncertain. Because the mind finds comfort in predictability. It seeks patterns, it wants guarantees, it wants to know what will happen next so that it can prepare, protect, and control. But life does not operate according to those demands. It moves in ways that cannot always be predicted. And when your need for certainty meets the reality of uncertainty, tension is created. And that tension becomes the source of anxiety, not because uncertainty is dangerous, but because your mind has been conditioned to believe that it is. The Stoics understood this conflict deeply, and instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, they trained themselves to become comfortable within it, because they recognized that uncertainty is not the enemy. It is simply a natural condition of life. And Epictetus taught that the more you try to control what is not within your power, the more disturbed you will become. And this applies directly to the need for certainty, because you cannot guarantee outcomes. You cannot predict every possibility. And the more you try, the more you exhaust yourself. But when you begin to accept uncertainty as something that cannot be removed, you reduce the need to constantly prepare for it. And this creates a sense of calm that is not dependent on knowing everything, but on trusting your ability to handle whatever happens. The moment trust begins to develop, you notice that your reactions start to change. Because you are no longer driven by the need to secure outcomes, you are guided by the ability to respond to them. And this shift moves your focus away from trying to predict the future and towards strengthening your present awareness, because the only place where your actions exist is in the present moment. And when your attention is anchored there, your actions become clearer, more effective, and more aligned with your intentions. You begin to understand that much of your previous anxiety was not about what was actually happening, but about what might happen, about scenarios that had not yet occurred and might never occur. And this realization weakens the hold that those imagined futures have over you, because you start to see them for what they are, possibilities, not realities. And this distinction allows you to release the urgency you once felt to prepare for everything, because you recognize that preparing for every possibility is not only impossible, but unnecessary. Seneca spoke about this when he warned against suffering in advance, explaining that many of the fears we carry never actually come to pass, and yet we experience them as if they were real. And this insight becomes more meaningful as you observe your own patterns, because you begin to see how often your mind creates problems that do not exist in the present, and how those imagined problems influence your emotions, your decisions, and your behavior. And once you recognize this, you begin to question whether your thoughts are guiding you or misleading you. While questioning becomes more consistent, your relationship with your thoughts begins to change because you are no longer accepting them automatically. You are examining them, you are evaluating whether they are useful or not, and this creates a level of mental clarity that allows you to act more deliberately because you are no longer reacting to every thought. You are choosing which ones to follow. This process also reveals how much of your identity has been shaped by patterns of thinking rather than conscious decisions, because the thoughts you repeat become the beliefs you carry, and the beliefs you carry influence the actions you take. And when those patterns are not examined, they continue to operate in the background, shaping your life without your awareness. But when you begin to bring awareness to them, you create the possibility for change because you can interrupt those patterns and replace them with more intentional ones. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on this, reminding himself to examine his own thoughts, to question their validity, to ensure that they were aligned with reason rather than emotion. And this practice becomes increasingly important as you realize that your thoughts are not always accurate reflections of reality. They are interpretations, influenced by past experiences, by emotions, by habits, and when you treat them as absolute truths, you limit your ability to respond effectively. As you continue to develop this awareness, you begin to feel less controlled by your internal dialogue because you are no longer fully identified with it. You are observing it from a distance, and this distance creates freedom because it allows you to choose your response rather than being driven by automatic reactions, and this freedom is one of the most valuable outcomes of Stoic practice because it allows you to live with intention rather than impulse. This shift also affects how you approach challenges because instead of viewing them as threats that must be avoided, you begin to see them as situations that can be navigated, as opportunities to apply what you have learned, and this perspective reduces the emotional intensity of challenges because they are no longer seen as overwhelming, they are seen as manageable, as something that can be approached with clarity and discipline. You begin to understand that resilience is not about avoiding difficulty, but about developing the ability to remain steady within it, and this steadiness comes from your ability to maintain control over your responses, regardless of external conditions. And this is why the Stoics place such importance on self-control, because it is the foundation of all other forms of strength. As this continues, your sense of urgency begins to change because you are no longer reacting to every situation as if it requires immediate action. You are able to assess, to pause, to decide, and this reduces the pressure you feel because you are no longer driven by impulse. You are guided by intention, and this creates a more balanced approach to life where you are engaged without being overwhelmed. You also begin to notice that your focus becomes more consistent because you are no longer dividing your attention between multiple unnecessary concerns. You are directing it toward what is important, toward what is within your control. And this focus allows you to make progress in a more efficient and effective way because you are not wasting energy on things that do not contribute to your growth. This efficiency creates momentum because when your actions are aligned with your intentions, you begin to see results, not necessarily immediate or dramatic, but consistent and meaningful. And this reinforces your confidence because you are able to see the impact of your actions over time. As this confidence grows, it becomes less dependent on external validation, because it is rooted in your own experience, in your ability to follow through, to remain disciplined, to act with clarity, and this creates a sense of self-reliance that is stable because it does not fluctuate with external feedback. You begin to understand that this self-reliance is not isolation, it is independence, the ability to engage with others without losing yourself, the ability to care without becoming dependent. And this balance allows you to form healthier relationships because you are no longer seeking validation, you are offering presence. When balance deepens, your interactions become more genuine because you are no longer performing or adjusting yourself to meet expectations. You are acting in alignment with your values, and this authenticity creates stronger connections because it is based on honesty rather than approval. You also begin to notice that your emotional responses become more stable because they are no longer triggered as easily by external events. You are able to maintain a sense of calm even when situations are uncertain, and this calm allows you to think more clearly, to make better decisions, and to respond more effectively. This clarity becomes one of your greatest strengths, because it allows you to navigate complexity without becoming overwhelmed, to see situations for what they are rather than what your mind projects onto them. And this reduces confusion because you are no longer adding unnecessary layers of interpretation. As this continues, you begin to feel a sense of alignment, where your thoughts, your actions, and your values are no longer in conflict. And this alignment creates a sense of peace that is not dependent on circumstances. It is simply the result of living in a way that is consistent with your understanding. You begin to see that this is not a final destination, but an ongoing process, something that requires continuous attention, because the mind will always have a tendency to drift, to return to old patterns, to seek comfort in familiar habits. But with awareness, you can recognize this drift and bring yourself back again and again to the principles that guide you. This repetition, this consistent return, is what creates lasting change, not a single moment of realization, but the ongoing practice of applying that realization in your daily life, in your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. And over time, this practice becomes part of who you are, shaping not only how you think, but how you live. As you continue forward, you begin to understand something that feels both simple and profound, that your life is not defined by the events that happen to you, but by the way you respond to them. And the more you align your responses with clarity, discipline, and intention, the more stable your life becomes, not because you have eliminated uncertainty, but because you have learned to move through it with strength. And in that strength, you find something that cannot be taken from you, something that does not depend on circumstances, something that remains steady even when everything else changes. And that is the power of a trained mind, a mind that is no longer controlled by fear, by impulse, or by external influence, but guided by reason, by awareness, and by choice. At a certain point in this journey, you begin to recognize that what once felt like pressure was often self-created, not because you intended to make life harder for yourself, but because your mind developed the habit of treating every situation as something that needed to be solved immediately. And this constant urgency created a sense of tension that followed you into every decision, every conversation, every moment of stillness. But when you begin to slow down and question that urgency, you start to see that not everything requires immediate action, not everything needs to be fixed. And this realization allows your mind to relax in a way that it may not have experienced for a long time. Gradually, another insight begins to surface, one that shifts how you interpret your own internal state, and that is the understanding that discomfort is not always a signal that something is wrong, but often a sign that something is changing, that you are moving beyond familiar patterns, that you are stepping into a space where growth is possible. And instead of reacting to discomfort as something to avoid, you begin to see it as something to observe, something that does not require immediate resistance. And this perspective reduces the intensity of your reactions because you are no longer trying to escape every uncomfortable feeling. Over time, this shift leads you to question the way you have been interpreting your emotions, because you begin to notice that emotions are temporary, that they rise and fall, that they change depending on your thoughts, your focus, your environment. And once you recognize this, you stop treating them as fixed truths. You stop making decisions based solely on how you feel in a given moment. and instead you begin to rely more on reason, on principles, on a deeper sense of clarity that is not affected by temporary fluctuations. In the process of observing your own reactions, you start to notice patterns that were previously invisible, recurring responses that appear in similar situations, habitual ways of thinking that shape your behavior without your awareness. And as you bring attention to these patterns, you gain the ability to interrupt them, to choose a different response, and this creates a sense of control that is not forced, but developed through awareness. From this perspective, the concept of discipline begins to take on a new meaning, because it is no longer something that feels restrictive, but something that feels empowering, something that allows you to act in alignment with your intentions rather than being pulled in different directions by impulse, and this alignment creates a sense of stability that extends into every area of your life. Meanwhile, your relationship with external events begins to change, because you are no longer interpreting every situation as something that must go your way. You are seeing events as neutral, as something that happens independently of your preferences, and this reduces the emotional charge that you once attached to outcomes, because you understand that your role is not to control what happens, but to control how you respond. As this understanding deepens, you begin to notice that your expectations become more flexible, less rigid, less demanding, and this flexibility allows you to adapt more easily to changes, to navigate uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed, and this adaptability becomes a source of strength because it allows you to remain steady even when circumstances shift. In moments where you would have previously felt the need to react immediately, you now find yourself pausing, creating space between the situation and your response. And within that space, you have the opportunity to choose your reaction, to act deliberately rather than impulsively, and this pause becomes one of the most valuable skills you develop because it gives you control over your actions. Through consistent practice, this pause becomes more natural, less forced, something that you rely on automatically, and this allows you to maintain composure in situations that once would have unsettled you, because you are no longer driven by immediate reactions, you are guided by intention. With this growing awareness, your attention begins to shift away from what you cannot control and toward what you can, your actions, your effort, your discipline, and this shift creates a sense of focus that was previously scattered because you are no longer dividing your energy between multiple concerns that do not contribute to your progress. Eventually, this focus leads to a greater sense of clarity because you are able to see situations more objectively without the distortion created by emotional reactions, and this clarity allows you to make decisions that are more aligned with your long-term intentions rather than short-term impulses. At the same time, your perception of time begins to change. Because you are no longer constantly looking ahead or looking back, you are more present, more engaged with what is happening now, and this presence allows you to experience life more fully because you are not distracted by thoughts about what has already happened or what might happen. In this state of presence, you begin to notice details that were previously overlooked, small moments, subtle changes, opportunities that were always there but unnoticed, and this awareness enhances your experience of life because you are more connected to what is actually happening. As your awareness expands, your sense of self becomes less dependent on external factors, less influenced by how others perceive you, and more grounded in your own values. And this creates a form of confidence that is stable because it is based on consistency rather than validation. Over time, this confidence allows you to act more freely, to make decisions based on what you believe is right rather than what you think will be approved, and this freedom reduces the pressure you once felt to conform because you are no longer seeking approval as a measure of your worth. In situations where you once felt the need to prove yourself, you now feel less urgency because you understand that your value is not determined by external recognition, but by your actions, your integrity, and your consistency. And this understanding allows you to move through life with less tension. As this continues, your relationships begin to shift as well, because you are no longer interacting from a place of need, you are interacting from a place of stability. And this creates more balanced and authentic connections because you are not relying on others to validate you. Within this balance, you also begin to set clearer boundaries, not as a reaction, but as a reflection of your understanding, because you know what is within your control and what is not, and this clarity allows you to engage with others without losing your sense of self. At this stage, your energy becomes more conserved, because you are no longer expending it on unnecessary concerns, and this conservation allows you to direct your effort toward what truly matters: your growth, your discipline, your ability to act with clarity. Through this process, your life begins to feel more intentional because your actions are no longer reactive, they are chosen, and this intentionality creates a sense of direction that was previously unclear. As this direction becomes more defined, you begin to experience a sense of progress, not because everything is perfect, but because you are moving forward consistently, and this progress reinforces your confidence because you can see the results of your actions over time. Eventually, you come to understand that this entire process is not about reaching a final state, but about maintaining a continuous practice, because the mind will always have a tendency to drift, and it is through awareness that you bring it back. And in that continuous return, you develop something that remains steady regardless of circumstances, a mind that is no longer easily disturbed, a presence that is grounded, and a way of living that is guided by clarity rather than reaction. And as you step away from this moment, remember this quietly but clearly: your life will not change when the world becomes easier. It will change when you become stronger, when your mind becomes steady, when your reactions become intentional, and when you stop giving your power to things that were never meant to control you. Because in the end, it is not what happens that defines you, it is how you stand in the face of it. If this message stays with you, if something inside you feels a little clearer, a little stronger, then don't stop here. There is another video on your screen right now that will help you go even deeper on this path. So take that next step. And truly, thank you for being here and for being a part of Psychresto Mind.